I was really struck by the line that you finished the first the end of that you finish your introduction with, where you say, "Love is not just as strong as death; it is stronger." And
Yeah.
so I read this line, in two very broad ways. The first of which being that love is stronger than death politically, in the sense that you can have death being a binding force politically, in which you
Hmm.
see and that tends to be when the worst things happen, and that love is the kind of counterforce that can overcome that as a sort of the center of a political platform or identity, but also existentially, in the sense of love is the thing that can overcome nihilism. So
Hmm.
I've been reading this line sort of as love being. You've talked so much about disappointment in your work, and this is now maybe a sign of reappointment. Um,
Hmm.
so what do you think about that reading, and what do you think about this line in general? This.
Well, it's actually a kind of memory of a a poem I wrote when I was about 22. It's one of those lines that, I mean, I didn't, I can't remember how it came out, but it came out, and I remembered sometime later that I'd written this poem, which was a response to the death of my girlfriend's father, and I was in the room when he died, and first time I'd seen someone die, and and at that time I stopped writing poetry some years later,
That's where
but
I'm at now.
at that time I was still writing poetry, and I think I probably took the line from John Donne. I think it's probably from Donne, or certainly something like that. It sounds like a line that metaphysicals would use. And is your audio? Is still there on audio?
Yes, I hear you. Do you hear me?
Okay, great.
Yeah,
That's fine. That's great. There
yeah.
was just a change. It must be my headphones. And so the first thing that you do in writing is that often you find yourself unconsciously quoting yourself from some
Of
earlier
course, of course.
version of yourself, and that's very odd.
Yeah.
There's that thing, and then the bigger question is really the question about love, and you know, it's the simplest way of framing it is to say that uh, philosophy on uh, philosophy on a certain model that I've tried to defend
Right.
is learning how to die, and and there's a sort of a more academic or scholarly version of that argument, and there's a sort of a lighter version of it in the Book of Dead Philosophers.
Right.
And at the end of the Book of Dead Philosophers, I end up um, posing this question about, there's a question about love in that book, which was beginning to take shape, and then over the years that has become more and more important. So, if philosophy is learning how to die, the problem with that is that philosophy is accepting your finitude, your mortality, all of that, and that's a good thing. But there is a certain selfishness or a certain being closed off to an experience like the experience of love,
Right.
which would be something else. It would be, I mean, the two formulations I use in the Fatalist are something like love is to give what one does not have, and to receive that over which one has no power. Uh, which is also, there's a line that Cornel West reminded me of Santayana, which I wrote down, which was, love is religion. Is religion is the love of life in the consciousness of impotence. The love
Oh.
of life and the
Yeah.
consciousness of impotence. And it's something like that. So love is that over which you have no power. So there's that shift in terms of thinking about love, which would also reflect back onto the question of
Mm.
philosophy, and point forward in all sorts of different ways we could pick up. It's
Yeah.
it's in many ways the most
Try-
important strand of the faith of the fatalists. I could say a lot
Yes.
more about it, but I don't want to talk too much.
Well, that's the point of you being here. Yeah.
Is it
Oh,
cool? there are political ramifications. The big ramification, the big initial ramification, is that it's a kind of axiom of modern philosophy, after Kant, that philosophy is concerned with finitude.
Right.
And isn't that wonderful? But a question that was pointed out to me years ago, about 5 years ago, by Alain Badiou, when he was responding to Infinitely Demanding, was the question of the infinite, and where this, it's there in my stuff, but have I really thought this through? Is there perhaps another dimension of what it means to be a self that exceeds my finiteness? And that opens the question, the sort of strange and difficult question of immortality. Now, what does that mean? I mean, I'm not claiming that, life goes on forever, but love is a kind of the imagining of a continuation of existence outside of yourself,
So
in relationship to another person, or in relationship to a child, or whatever it might be. It's a kind of going on. So in a sense that if there is in philosophy an idea of the philosophical life as the life which has to be lived in relationship to the limits of finitude, then there's a question that can be raised about that. Perhaps there are other ways of leading a life, and perhaps love would disrupt that and challenge that.
Well, a little bit of what you were saying reminds me of, in some of my favorite writers, Virginia Woolf and Joyce, especially. There's this sense. I know you write about Joyce, so talking about his son Rudy, not his son, but Bloom's son. There's this sense of this is someone who never lived, presumably only for a few hours, a few days, but yet the essence of that love is it almost recreates itself. The love for his son is recreated in Stephen. And it is a sense a binding force and an atemporal force, or at least if it's not completely atemporal, it can leap sort of from person to person. And so this initial love that he has for his unborn child really doesn't die. And the same is true, I think, in To the Lighthouse, for instance, and countless examples. These are the ones I know better. Where Mrs. Ramsay, no one can believe that Mrs. Ramsay died. That her death, their love for her seems to somehow extend beyond the fact of her death. So maybe it's a cognitive illusion, but it's a very, very, very powerful one.
Yeah, I mean, people, people die, they go into the ground and all of that. But I am. Was a couple of things. I mean, I'm working on finished a book on Hamlet, on Shakespeare's Hamlet, and obviously it's about many things, but it's about ghosts,
right?
And it's about the reality of ghosts in all sorts of ways. And in many ways, that moment and the other book I'm reading this summer is Ulysses again, which I got I was in Dublin at the end of March for a bunch of things connected to the Faith of the Fatalist, right. And bought a copy of Ulysses in Sweeney's Chemist. Which is Joyce, Joyce Museum. I've just been going over that, and it's true that because also the two things are linked insofar as the what's at the centre of Ulysses is the problem of Hamlet, which is Stephen is wrestling with
ghosts.
And he's wrestling with ghosts and the idea that Shakespeare played the ghost. There is that tradition that Shakespeare played the ghost, and also that Shakespeare's father had died before the year before, or 2 years before the first productions of Hamlet, recorded productions of Hamlet, and that Shakespeare had a son called Hamnet. So there's that going on in the background, which at the same time Joyce says is just it's just clergyman's speculations on the historicity of Jesus, right? Was Shakespeare was this linked to facts in Shakespeare's life? But in Ulysses, it plays out in relationship to the son and the father. You have a son who has no father, who denies his father, Stephen Dedalus, and a father without a son. Jew, Greek, Jew, and they bus shelter, outside the night town in Dublin. So in a sense, it's it's an extraordinary study in the impossibility of father-son love, and then it's also about the the other feature of what makes Joyce so extraordinary is Molly Bloom's soliloquy. There are people that can write, can maybe write a Bloom, but to write Daedalus, a Bloom, and everything else in those different forms, and to write Molly Bloom's soliloquy. So Ulysses is about love, based around the impossibility of the family structure. Because every level the family structure has broken down, or Bloom is the cuckold. Stephen's mother has died, which is why he's back in Dublin. All these displacements in the family, but about love. And yeah, I don't know what I'm gonna do with Ulysses, or probably do nothing with it. But it's just, I've been watching, also just fascinated with the way in which Joyce constructs sentences. Just been reading and trying to think about how that works.
Tell me a little bit about the Hamlet book. I mean, I know we got a little bit off track. If you don't mind, I don't know.
No, me too. It's going to come out next year. It's still not finished. It's the connection with love is all over the place, insofar as it's co-written with my wife, right. And who is a psychoanalyst, and so it's a difficult love.
One can only imagine.
So there's it's a project that we had to try and write together, and to do it in around an object, Hamlet, and the plan began to form last winter. We wrote it throughout the winter, and of course, at the heart of Hamlet is Hamlet who cannot love, right? I mean. Dostoevsky says, I think it's Dostoevsky says that hell is the incapacity to love. Right? That's right. Hell is the incapacity to love, and that's the hell that Hamlet is in. And he is someone who perhaps says to Ophelia, "I loved you once," past tense, and then I don't love you. So there's this renunciation of love, which is also a renunciation of his desire. And what we see in the place of that in Hamlet is an extraordinary display of inhibition and violence. So what he based himself with language and antic. It's in a weird way, although it's a very different topic. It's in continuity with the last work I've been doing, but I'm also very interested in. No, I am very interested, and have been for a long time, in forms of four-handed or six-handed writing, or different forms, and because it just breaks up the sort of authority of the supposed authority of the author and so and it's the most extended piece collaboration I've done. And it's it's out next year, and we'll see. It's pretty weird.
So I was thinking, I read on the Wikipedia page that this book. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Was coming out, and so I began to think a little bit about the connections between Faith of the Faithless and Hamlet. I mean, it led me to think about a quote I remember from Harold Bloom, where he says something like, if Iago walked onto the stage in Hamlet, or if Hamlet walked onto the stage in Othello, Hamlet would immediately be able to see through the lies of Iago, that he's just that much smarter than everyone else in Shakespeare. But what's interesting, and this is in relation to his inability to love, is that, in a way, if he could love, he would be the Critchleyan political hero, in a sense, and his ability to resist authority, to create space within this dark, horrible kingdom of Denmark, right? He has the capacity to do so. In fact, maybe the only person who has the capacity to do so, yet he can't. And that's the central paradox, is he could do good. And
It's the capacity, and he has the right, you know.
He has the right, certainly.
The prince, and he has the ambition, and he says to Laertes, he has something dangerous in him. There's something dangerous in me. And so there is a sort of violence or force in Hamlet, which, if unleashed, could be politically incredibly powerful. So yes, he could be a political hero. He isn't. He is a source of yearning for an order that's disappeared, namely the order of his father, which is the world that's disappeared with his death, and then, as he discovers, his murder. And the new world is illegitimate. That's out of joint. It's rotten. And the play ends with a foreign occupation. Ends with the occupation of Denmark by Fortinbras, who's the son of the person that Hamlet's father defeated. So it ends with a kind of political capitulation. It's very strange in that regard.
Repetition, in a sense, or reversal.
A repetition and a reversal. It's very the politics of Hamlet are very, very odd. But he could have been a great king. Maybe not. Maybe he would have been. You know, that we can't get around the fact he has such an idealized view of his father, and such a debased view of his mother, that, you know, we get the debased view of the mother in the play, but the ideal view of the father is never really questioned. Right? He was a man. And also going back to Othello, I mean, one thing that we do in the book, or at least it's suggested, is that maybe the Iago character.
Sorry, I'm getting a phone call.
Maybe the Iago character in Hamlet is Horatio. The Horatio, loyal Horatio, the great friend, actually might not be such a great friend after. We try and make that argument.
Can you push that a little further, or explain that? It's very interesting.
You know, we think of Horatio as this slightly loyal, but perhaps slightly foppish fellow student from Wittenberg. But, you know, we developed the idea that maybe there is the suspicion that he is a spy in a world of spies. We talk about espionage in Hamlet. It's full of, it's a play that's just full of everybody spying on everybody else. So there's no way of knowing this. It's simply a speculation that maybe Horatio is Fortinbras' spy. Maybe Horatio is kind of preying on Hamlet, preying on the grief-stricken young prince, knowing he's susceptible, could be turned with the right external show, like something like a ghost. Horatio's not above suspicion. So, but yeah, Hamlet is cleverer than Othello. But I don't know. I've not thought about, is Hamlet cleverer than...
Well, it's a very Harold Bloomian thing to assert. You know, maybe
Bloom really comes off badly in our book. I won't go into that, but Bloom is a fall guy, and because one thing that we argue, because Bloom, like most people that write on Hamlet, really insist that Hamlet changes. He comes back a new man, or at least a changed man. We say he doesn't, and there's no sort of message of authenticity in Hamlet. There's something else, something more interesting, and something more macabre. So people want to draw a kind of, you know, a humanist moral from Shakespeare, and you can do that, but there's something much more interesting going on in Shakespeare, philosophically more interesting and challenging, which is not so. We that's where Bloom gets a bit of a hard time.
So there are kind of a couple of questions I have coming out of that. One just is about the nature of the book. I see it. Well, actually, I'll come back to this, but I do see it as it seems to be a triangulation of psychoanalysis, philosophy, and literary criticism. I know elements of that have been in your work, obviously, previously, but this is the first time where they all seem to be getting equal, or somewhat equal, playing time.
It's true.
What was that experience like, just writing like that, thinking like that?
It's hard. I mean, it's, for me, which makes me odd as someone that's meant to be a philosopher, is that I think I'm never quite sure of what I think, and I'm always persuaded by what other people think. I'm inclined to think people are right and I'm wrong, which means I find being with other people rather interesting. Defend things that I say. So now, this, I guess, the big change in this this book is the prominence given to psychoanalysis. I suppose it's there, but I mean, my wife is that's what she does. She sees people and she talks with them and listens to them. It's a very, and I'm interested in psychoanalysis as a theory and all of that, but I'm more interested in psychoanalysis as an actual practice, listening and speaking and interpretation. So the book is an interpretation, and in a sense we live in a culture which is terrified by interpretation. It's odd, it's what we do, but we want not interpretation, we want determination, we want some causal account of is in the brain causes love or makes us incapable of love or whatever. All of that. Whereas what we do as creatures is to interpret, to lay things out, to re-describe, and that's the real question then is what gives an interpretation force, persuasive force, power. It's also at the center of this book, in a different way, is questions of rhetoric as well.
Right, of course.
Because it's another. I've got. Yeah, I mean, it would take a long time to unravel, but I'm increasingly interested in questions of persuasion and rhetoric. And philosophy is some discourse which trumps persuasion.
So rhetoric as a tool for politics, as a tool for ethics, as the enemy of ethics, as the enemy of politics. How do you think about those things?
Well, that's what traditionally rhetoric is the enemy, right? So
sophistry.
Sophistry is the enemy. What the only things we know about sophistry are 20 odd pages of fragments and notes, and then we have Plato's version, which is like
very biased. Yeah,
it's like asking Christian monks for faithful records of the Bible.
Right.
So Plato has to erect this divide between philosophy and sophistry, which we continue to operate within, and I just don't buy it. I think there are differences, sure, but I mean the obvious similarity is that this all turns. There's another book which I'm not going to write yet because I'm not capable of it, but it was the book that I was going to write last year, which is on ancient tragedy.
Right, I remember that in interviews you talked a lot about that. Yeah.
Lots of work, and there's piles of it over there, and there's lots to but it's kind of there's no shape to it. It's messy, and it's just not ready, and it's not. so I'll give it again as a course in a couple of years and try and think it through again. But at the centre of that is really the idea that philosophy is has a problem with theatre, in general, and the problem with theatre is a problem with illusion, deception, but perhaps most obviously with rhetoric and persuasion. That people are using elaborate rhetorical legal arguments in Greek tragedies, often to no effect, sometimes to some effect, often to no effect, and that what underpins that is a kind of excessive emotion, and in particular an excessive emotion, grief and lamentation. So what you've got in ancient tragedy is something like an experience of grief or lamentation, which is linked to language and which is deployed in forms of argument. Antigone is the most obvious example. The brother is dead, and she argues with Creon. So philosophy in Plato's Republic has to shut down that sophistical experience of theatre and the kind of moral ambiguity which seems to be at its heart, and then the story begins. And I want to push very hard at that and say, actually there is a philosophical view of things in tragedy which is superior, just more deeper, more interesting, and more attuned to where we are and what we need, I think, than the version that we get from endless reiterations of Socrates.
So this reminds me a little bit of Woody Allen often says, I have this great comic book gift, but I'd trade it in a second for the tragic gift, and he said this in a lot of interviews. And I sort of in preparation for this interview, I rewatched The Thin Red Line last night, and it's one of those films where you're watching it going, this is just so much better in a sense. I mean, it's so powerful and so moving. I was in my basement at like 3 in the morning, like crying, But there's this sense that when tragedy is done right, and that's a very different form of tragedy, but I think it is in Malick. There's an overwhelming emotional response.
Yeah.
And so that, I think philosophically, I can only imagine that, there's a joke here about you as the philosopher of impossible objects sort of being drawn into this sort of honeypot of impossible objects, which is tragedy. I mean, within lamentation, grief, every sort of powerful emotion, along with irony and comedy.
Yeah. I mean, Malick. Let's talk about Malick for a moment.
Yeah, please.
Malick is fascinated me for years because, for a number of reasons. Because the films are very good. The first 3 films are very good. Yeah. Other views on the last 2, but let's put that to one side. The first 3. Red Line for me was, I saw it in a Brew and View cinema in Chicago in 8. Yeah. With beer and it was on a huge screen, and it totally captivated me. And then it just turned out some of the people that had taught me and some people I knew in students of Malick, students with Malick
at Harvard,
and so I then began to just poke around and found out some information. The main thing that interested me was what was involved in the transition from being a graduate student in philosophy to becoming a filmmaker, and there's a philosophical aspect to Malick for sure. It's sort of obvious, but what is it about film or cinema that's able to carry that text or writing a dissertation couldn't carry that? And that's interesting. That what you often have with movie directors, people who've got extraordinary intelligence and determination and all the rest, but often um, not a kind of unformed that's terribly arrogant thing to say, but I'm thinking in particular of someone like I'm thinking in particular of Kubrick. You know, a kid with a camera on the streets of New York that did photos, and one thing led to another, and he made movies. And there was all of this stuff going on with Kubrick, but you felt it was sort of often unresolved in the movies. It was fascinating and brilliant. Whereas Malick has got a much more clear sense of that there's a structure there. There's a and then what is it about film that's able to carry? What is it about film that's where it's able to become a medium of thought? And I think that Thin Red Line is a successful version of that. Although successful, the film's
Yes.
7 hours long, and they cut out half of it. They cut out. If you look at the Jim Jones book, they cut out the whole main story, which is about Fife, I think.
Oh, no kidding.
Character who barely appears in the
Barely.
film.
He doesn't say anything.
In the main story, or at least another main story. So there's but it works. It works and so that was really my concern, and something about sensation that what an emotion that Matt is some sort of Heideggerian, and get a bad press because Heidegger was a Nazi and all of that. But
Yeah.
think about what Heidegger was fascinated with was exploring different media for thinking, right? And he was a way of doing it. But poetry, another way of doing that, and maybe technology was another way of doing that too. So, thinking about in Malick, if you begin from the proposition that film thinks in some way, cinema thinks, is doing that on the screen, not as it were applying ideas to cinema or allowing us to read through the screen to ideas in something, but as it were allowing that to move on the surface of the screen, something like that.
So this is a stretch, but you said earlier that watching a Malick film it feels clear, and to me the way I would put that is it feels ready-made, it feels preformed, that his whole sensibility, his whole way of looking at the world. I would say there's no Malickian opening montage that's not apparently his, and I can't think of one that's not powerfully moving. But in a way that reminds me a little bit of Stevens, where there's this, even in the early work, there's this automatic sort of philosophical disposition that's not stated, that isn't said in any way, but it's always there, and it's underpinning the harmonium to the very end, to the rock.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the Stevens, the Malick ended up as the postface or appendix to a little book on Stevens.
Right, of course you. I read that, yeah. So
Stevens is, the two things were intimately linked in my mind, and I was, again, what interested me in Stevens was not philosophizing through poetry, or through the word to some meaning. Mm-hmm. That Stevens developed a meditative form that was very idiosyncratic, that was able to carry thought, right? That wasn't propositional, that wasn't it was a whole nother. So Stevens is, again, thinking philosophically in poetry the way that Malick is thinking philosophically. It's always been that attempt to shift the weight of thought from concepts to objects that has been an obsession of mine, and the idea that there is, which is something, the impossible objects idea. There are practices, a range of things which are thinking, and you can't simply conceptualize them or comprehend them or render them intelligible. We have to attend to them in some other way.
So would you say is this a Heideggerian project then, going back to what you said, in some way?
It is It is my residual Heideggerianism. Um, it's would take a long time, or be hard to. I'm not even sure I could explain it, but yeah, you know, and I'm the other philosopher I maybe most deeply committed to is Levinas, and Levinas was sort of in some civil war with Heidegger his whole career.
So that's why you married a psychoanalyst to resolve that in your own head.
So thing, and but Heidegger, you know, for me, is trying to do something incredibly simple, which is to for there to be thinking, and for thinking to take place not in the head, but to take place in relationship to things that are used, hammers, all the rest, the sort of work world in Being in Time, but also in relationship to other people and all the rest. So it's a sort of, and it's the idea that I guess the Heideggerianism is the suspicion of theory and the suspicion of philosophy as a theoretical enterprise. That, you know, Heidegger shows that the primacy of practice, the primacy of human lived life, and this gets missed in our usual dealings with the world and reduced to a kind of set of frameworks. And so therefore to simply describe, to interpret life in the world turns out to be enormously hard. Choice, you know, and that's why we need these other characters. Is that somehow we don't read it for entertainment, or although it can be entertaining, or for we read it because it gives us back to us some sense of being in the world. So in that sense, I'm a Heideggerian, and in the in Faith of the Faithless, the part that I'm most proud of, which has not really been picked up yet, but let's hope it does, is the reading of Heidegger in the discussion of St. Paul, which is really, you know, it's hardcore head-banging, you know, German terminology crunching.
And that's why it hasn't been picked up.
It's usually just a flag faith. You know,
right. The
reading of Heidegger's Being in Time, where I try and finally identify what it is about Heidegger's early project that interests me, and to sort of tell that story. And yeah, there's 1,000 things, like I say, about Heidegger, and there's something about that early project of a description of life in the world, or the hermeneutics of facticity, as he called it. It's just I find enormously compelling.
And I mean, for you, you seem to have Heidegger also went back to the Greeks, maybe in a different way, but both of you seem to see that as, again, a nexus for that kind of living in the world. Although it's hard to say, you said yourself, it's hard to say precisely what that is, but it seems to be there.
Very much at odds with Heidegger on the Greeks, but sure, the Greeks, you know, the question becomes one of which Greeks. I mean, we can't.
Right.
And, whether you go with the pre-Socratics or with the tragic poets or whatever, but for me, it's you know, I mean, to put it rather piously, there's a responsibility. I think each generation has a responsibility to pass on something true but odd about antiquity. And antiquity, the wonderful thing about antiquity, let's say Greek antiquity, is how much we don't know about it.
That's right.
Have is a bundle of texts in languages that are very hard to understand, and we have no context, very little context we know less than we
Which
like.
is why the Germans could construct a whole identity around it.
Yeah.
And
Reimagined and reimagined as something which is not conservative but subversive. I think that's the other thing, is that
that's interesting.
So this is sort of, if you like, a leftist traditionalism, that that the task of the left is always to frame history in its deepest and most radical way as something which doesn't support the present but challenges it. That seems to me, that's the imperative of history for us. So, and that's going back to Sophocles and finding not the glory that was Greece, but that was whose frame was war, a culture that was struggling with the strains and limitations of imperialism, that was in play after play, dealing with the relationship between the home and the foreign, the Greek and the non-Greek, the relationships between men and women, all this stuff we deal with is being played out there. So so we make the Greeks in our image.
And that's something you've expressed a serious problem with, I think, in the interview book Impossible Objects. I think you talk about that. You talk about it in Faith of the Faithless. Do you see this as a particularly pernicious misconception? I mean, I could see how it has played out that way.
I think it is.
Because you do talk about constructive illusion, actually, in Faith of the Faithless, so it's an interesting tension there, right? Between...
Yeah, I mean, it's... We can do nothing but feed the ancients with our own blood.
Yes, of course.
They need... so it's only going to be... So what we're going to see is us. So there's no way of getting around that problem of the image. What Germans saw in the Greeks in the 19th century was what they wanted to see, and it's not that it was wrong. It has to be what's involved in forms of, say, national identity formation or whatever it might be. But at this point, for me. At this point, for me, theatre is a more compelling sort of arena for thinking through ideas than the usual way we think about philosophy. And by theatre, I mean different forms of spectacle, but it could be actual theatre. That somehow, theatre is able to affirm a world that is metaphysically opaque and unclear, where forces, shaped by forces and by violence which is out of control and seemingly never ending, and where people seem to be morally convinced of things which enter into collision with people who are morally convinced of other things. And that conflict is what we see in tragedy. Conflict, collision. We see dialectic, right? It's dialectic. So I guess at this point in July 2012, it's that version of tragedy's dialectic that I find maybe most compelling.
Do you also see tragedy as related to something that has appeared a lot in your work, which is motivation?
Yes.
Idea, tragedy as a motivating force, politically, ethically, what have you?
It's more, it could be. It's the problem is more of a. It's very important to me, the work I'm doing on ethics kept coming back to the question of motivation. How we live in a sort of a problem that we have is a problem of radical demotivation,
yes,
right? Which is expressed as cynicism or distance, irony, nihilism, all the rest. and that's a very easy, it's a very reasonable position to take up, and anyway, it's the position that we should take up with respect to the spectacle of, say, normal governmental politics. But how might a subject be motivated to act on some conception of the good? Ethical experience and infinitely demanding, and then try to, come up with my own model of what a motivational subject might look like. It's nobody, but that's what that's the deal. But the theory I quite like, and in theatre, I guess you look at a complexity of motivation. You see people powerfully motivated.
Yes.
Powerful motivation entering into a collision with someone else who's also powerfully motivated. Crayon, and then destroy each other. Orestes and Clytemnestra, or whatever it might be. We see, and there's something in that collision that interests me. I mean, it would be a slightly separate topic, but it's linked, to think about motivation in relationship to where we are now. Now, I mean, in many ways, the problem has been answered, not answered, but the sort of two going, which is that the normal politics, particularly in Western Europe, maybe it's different in the US, particularly in Western Europe, is increasingly demotivated. Will have less and less faith in institutions and parties and usual structures, but that's led to, on the one hand, to cynicism, but it's led to forms of non-governmental political. It's led to things like Occupy and its different forms, or it's led to different resistance movements and all the rest. So the question I have at the moment, I guess, is whether, so for example, Occupy was a wonderful example of motivation in action.
That's right.
People who were motivated to act on the basis of a conception of the good, or on the basis of a conception that there was a wrong, right? That banks got bailed out, we got sold out. That politics can take shape. Powerful. How do you sustain that? How do you harness that? How do you frame that? These are the more difficult questions.
I think, well, I mean, from the experience of someone who was living in New York City, and one of my best friends was at Occupy every day taking photographs, and she got to. I learned most of my good information about the movement just from her, because she was far more involved in a way than I was. But I think it brings up for me all sorts of questions about the mode in which my generation thinks. Because of the way, for instance, we're having this conversation now, in the way that all of us have been brought up in a way. This might be a very reductive point, but to only like things for a short period of time, politically, a short attention span is extremely dangerous. Because it becomes, I was afraid, and I would actually look, if you went on Facebook at the time and go on any college sort of campus, look at any group of people I went to Syracuse, and the Syracuse kids were just posting, going down to Occupy, going to take the bus down to Occupy, but it was just for the Disney World effect of being there, and then they're going to get back on the bus and go back. And so this is a huge problem of motivation. In fact, it wasn't real motivation, it was sophistical motivation in a way. And that's not to say that the real activists involved weren't doing a great job, and they were. The problem was that their message got lost, and there doesn't seem to be any reason for it other than the way we are, at least my age group. And
well, let me say, youth. Every generation is defined by an experience of youth.
Right.
It was defined by punk, and which meant that the 60th generation were the most alien, because we had no idea, always failure of that project. We saw a lot of complacent hippies who were, proclaiming love and peace, but doing little about it apart from getting stones that seem to be. So there was that. So the 60s idea of youth, and that's come back. You know, there's an awful lot of the place where I work at the New School, a kind of sympathy for Occupy, but within that sympathy, a sort of sense in which, well, we know better. You know, we went through this, and listen, and you can take our seminar on nauseating. So, because I think the stakes for contemporary youth are very, very different, and obviously what emerged around the so-called Arab Spring, or let's say the uprisings in North Africa and that part of the world, are also around the question of youth. You know, new constituency, a new generation found its voice in conditions of, you know, minimal possibilities and great danger. Here, you know, the danger is there from NYPD and whatever, but it's more that the 60s generation enjoyed a luxury in comparison to young people these days. There's a sense in which, you know, to be young is to be in debt, right?
That's right, of course.
So your being is being in debt. So the new version of the cogito is, you know, I owe, therefore I am. That's that's the truth. And if you don't owe, you are not. So, and what do you do with that debt? And so the sense in which the sense of diminished possibilities, really diminished possibilities, and a sense of being captive to a system through debt, fundamentally changes what it means, the subjectivity of what it means to be young than it did a generation ago.
I think it's not even debt. Debt is a huge part of it, but it's also the nature of employment today is radically different. How many of my friends, I refused to do them, but did unpaid internships or internships for pennies, and that creates a whole system of inequality, because they're the ones whose parents can afford to send them to a city like New York to work for free for a summer. So it's bad for them, but it's even worse for the people who don't get inside, you know, that internship system. Wages aren't good, and wages are also insecure. So there's our identity, and I could say this about almost any one of my friends, is there's this growing identity of displacement, you could say, or insecurity. It's becoming a collective identity, and how is that going to shape our consciousness? I don't think in a good way.
I don't know. You know, at some point, I hope that of, you know, the American political system will just be exposed for what it is. That this fraud perpetrated on people, you know, that's telling you things that nobody feels. Maybe some populations feel that, but there's a sort of people that are not included by any aspect of that discourse, it seems to me. So displacement, I think that's absolutely right, and it could be, but I think that one thing I say, I think that the discipline of the left, as I understand it, is always to refuse questions of the future. You know, because the future is always the province of the opinion pages and what's going to happen in the next few years, the trends. The discipline of resistance, cultivation of historical sensibility, and the deeper truths that can be acquired through that. And the history of resistance is always a history of failure. It's always a history of things happening, ceasing to happen, seeming to fail, and then the effects of that unraveling 10, 15 years later. So I'm not pessimistic at all about Occupy. It happened. The thing is, it happened. Yes. And there were people like, you know, Syracuse students who came down for the spectacle. That's okay. Yeah. It happened. It took place. Enabled. It it's already enabled all sorts of other things to happen, and it's enabled a kind of unraveling of a whole system, I think, or the beginning of an unraveling of that. What I mean, you know, the internships, for example. Ships are it's a grotesque lie. You know, it's an awful system. It's a kind of internment, you know, and it's done through privilege, and that's the way the media system works and the publishing system work and all the rest of it. In terms of educational institutions, the absurd fees that are demanded, you know, and how that's going to be consistent with what people can afford or what people will be prepared to pay, and you know, the new forms of, not new forms, but I think one thing that happened as a consequence of Occupy were new forms of informal educational structures over the place, just reading groups, or, you know, which can sometimes be formalized, like public school in New York, but sometimes it can just be people getting together to discuss something. And, you know, you can watch stuff online. You can see, you know, you can do an entire BA at Harvard, not by. So I think, you know, one of the consequences of Occupy, oddly, is that I think it really does lead one to question the nature of education and what, you know, what on earth is going on there, because it seems to have lost its way.